About an hour.
All right, that's great. Just so I know how to pace myself.
Yeah.
Okay, we are live. My name is Dr. Sharnael Wolverton Sehan, and I am here with Craig and Paul Wallis. This is Swiftfire True TV. Really excited about this topic here today regarding revisiting Genesis. And Paul is an author, and I'm going to have him explain a little bit about some of his books and the topic for today. But Craig, I would love for you to jump in and say a few words too. And also remind everybody, go to swiftfire.org. Please go to swiftfire.org and jump on the newsletter. Do your due diligence and sharing and tagging away with this interview today so we can get the word out and help some people get some more information about this topic. Is going to be so fun. And Craig, what you got to say?
Well, it was my idea to get Paul on because as a part of my journey, I've stumbled upon his work, which is completely, dare I say, blowing my mind. As people know, Paul, Sharnael and I have come through sort of the Christian world. Sharnael was a Christian minister for many years. And for me, I think it'd be really important as well for you to talk about where you've come from, because you were a priest, were you not?
Or absolutely. You not? Yes, I am. Yes, once a priest, always a priest. Thanks both for having me on your show, by the way. It's great to be in conversation with you. To go to my background, I was 33 years in Christian ministry, working as a church planter, as a theological educator, as a church doctor, and an archdeacon for the Anglican Church in Australia. And in my training of pastors, one of my main focuses was hermeneutics, which are the principles of interpreting ancient texts. And so with my pastor students, I'd sit down with them and teach them to do what we would call form criticism, which is where you look at the text and work out what kind of literature is this, and therefore how do we handle it? And you look for clues in the text and in the context to answer that for you. And then we'd do something called source criticism, which is, where did these texts come from? What are the sources? How do they differ from the sources, and why? And then, because I'm a linguist, that's my first love, the essential question, what do the words mean? Mm-hmm. And it was actually all those disciplines that led me through the world of ministry into the world of paleo contact, which is what my recent books are all about.
Oh, well, I'm just at the end of Escaping from Eden. And I've got to say, well, for me, I first encountered this information about 4 years ago. I've spoken quite publicly about going through a sort of religious deconstruction and discovering kind of interpretations of the Bible are not entirely accurate to the original ideas of the authors and of the ancient texts. And I hadn't really approached the Old Testament. It was mainly the New Testament, New Covenant aspect and the work of Jesus, etc. But your book is taking us into the Old Testament and your work, which is really, really fascinating, because as I was just about to explain, in about 2017, I encountered Michael Tellinger talking about this stuff. Now, I've seen on your YouTube channel, I cannot recommend The Fifth Kind and your personal channel enough, by the way. We'll talk about that in a bit. And honestly, I wasn't ready for it. When I heard it from Michael Tellinger, I was like, whoa, a bit too much for me. But over the years, and I've been going through this journey with Sharnael, discovering things, particularly about modern ET, extraterrestrial things going on. I saw a YouTube video by a channel called the Bible Society, I think it's called, and it's a couple of Jewish guys who've done some really good videos on Jewish thought and Hebraic thought of the scriptures. And they saw it about the Elohim, that they spoke about the Elohim, and they described the Elohim as like the word Elohim describes more of a title, like we would use mother, for example. Many women or ladies can be a mother. In the same way, Elohim can be many different beings. and it kind of settled it in my mind. Like, I'm ready for this information now. And then obviously I've come across your work, and it's just really, really changing my whole worldview, and certainly of our history and of our very existence as a species. So would you be able to talk a bit about who are the Elohim?
Yes, definitely. So you watched that video and you were provided with a little white rabbit to follow down a rabbit hole. And so it begins with the realization that Elohim is a plural word, masculine plural. It takes plural form verbs, and it demonstrates plural behaviors. And so the first shift in thinking is to realize that it doesn't mean God. And all the texts throughout the Hebrew scriptures where it's been translated as God, you have to go back and say, okay, we can now get closer to the sources and read it how these texts were in the beginning, when this word was a simple plural. So yes, there's quite a spectrum of how people respond to this information. And yes, there are some great scholars who will actually bite the bullet and go there. As soon as you realize that there's a diversity of entities being described in the Hebrew scriptures, you then begin to look at their behavior in a new light, and you're willing to ask translation questions that would never have occurred to you before, where you're reading texts we've always told as God stories. You realize it's an Elohim story, and you then ask, should it have been translated God on this occasion? Because in some texts it is translated as God, in others it's demon, false god, landlord. Which does it mean, and how do the translators decide? Essentially, they decided in more recent times on the basis of context. When the Elohim appear to be on the right side of history or have the upper hand, well, we'll translate it as God. When that's impossible, well, they must be false gods. But it's the same word. Dig a little deeper into the history of the formation of the Hebrew scriptures, and you realize that tons of Elohim stories have been airbrushed over by applying the holy name of God over the top. So they will glue the name Yahweh into an earlier Elohim text. And this is in no way deceitful. It's all done in plain sight. You know, the moment you see the holy name Yahweh in a story that predates Moses, it tells you straight away someone after the time of Moses who knew that name has retold an earlier story, put the name Yahweh in. So like you, Craig, I discovered this when I finally had the time to sit down and do some real study and wanted to drill down into all the questions I hadn't been able to answer in the 30 years previously. I realized that I had to go back and read the Elohim stories using the root meaning of the word. I asked myself, how do the stories roll if every time I come across this word, I translate it as a masculine plural? And of course, the stories change, but they don't change in a random way. They immediately flip around and line up in parallel with the ancient Mesopotamian stories, the Babylonian, Akkadian, Assyrian, Sumerian stories. And it becomes apparent very quickly that the Bible stories of beginnings, the Bible's Elohim stories, are the summary form of the ancient Mesopotamian stories. Now, that's difficult enough. You talk about all the reframing that's necessary with this information, because all of a sudden you have to concede, okay, our book is based on someone else's book. Ask the next question, what's their book about? It's not about God. The Elohim stories, the stories of the powerful ones, to use the root meaning, is the summary form of the Sumerian stories of the sky people. Read the sky people stories, and it becomes pretty clear pretty quick. We're reading about extraterrestrials.
Well, we got straight to the bottom there, didn't we, Sharnael?
Interesting.
Well, obviously, where do you go from there? Because
well, exactly.
that was just the beginning of the story for me.
Well, and we've seen even in art and ancient art where there were ships painted on the caves, and different artists who have added that, or it's there right away, part of history, but I guess maybe we just like glossed over or just kind of tried to keep it on the down low. Or what do you think do you think it was on purpose, or do you think it was like a controlled situation, or when you say glued on top, do you literally mean something was on top glued, like to cover it up?
No, I mean that we know that the Hebrew scriptures formed as more and more scrolls were added in various stages, and each time there was a big addition, they would rework the whole thing into a single work. So that happened with the Pentateuch, so that it's reworked to teach the Mosaic law. And then more books are added, it becomes a Deuteronomistic history. It's reworked, harmonized to authenticate the Mosaic law, the monarchy, and the priesthoods, and on it rolls until about the 6th century BCE. So each time there's an editing, it's a scissors and paste editing, and then this word gets imported into earlier texts to make it seem like a seamless story of God from the beginning, except that the shape of the stories themselves clue you that something else is going on. So when Joshua tells the people of God to cut themselves off from the Elohim, well, there's a little clue. Elohim doesn't mean God. Or when Elohim and Yahweh are battling over Abraham's son Isaac, whether or not he should be killed, there's a little clue. You've got two different entities in conflict. Or when Yahweh describes himself as an Elohim in competition with the Elohim of Ekron, you think, well, wait a minute. Who is he again? And so the stories are all still there, just beneath the surface. And so what's pasted over is essentially just this later name for God that obscures who the Elohim are. So it's not actually that difficult to get to the sources, to get to the older stories, and then the confirmation of reading the Mesopotamian sources and realizing they line up with narratives all around the world. That's what really convinces most people that there is another story of human origins that has been curated for thousands of years. Now, Sharnael, you mentioned curated in art, and that is fascinating. There are a couple of layers to that story. If you go back to cave paintings or rock art, such as we have here in Australia, I think it's very straightforward that we've got images where people etched or painted what they saw. And so they saw horses, they painted horses. They saw woolly rhinos, they painted woolly rhinos. They saw a flying saucer and a wormhole and a small grey, so they painted that. I think it really is that simple. But I don't know if it's changing now, but certainly in my youth, if I looked at those images and said, wait a minute, that's a flying saucer, isn't it? That's a small grey, isn't it? Some art authority would come along and say, oh no, we see plenty of these. They are ancient images of, well, we're not quite sure what, but obviously it's not a flying saucer. And because an authority says it, you say, oh, okay, I must have interpreted that wrong. But some of the images are so clear. If you get a little later into history and you look at the works of, well, there's a very famous painting from Carlo Crivelli, which I think was 1468, something like that, of the Annunciation. So the Annunciation is when Mary is told she's going to have a baby by some strange, unfamiliar means. It's told in a particular way in the texts. Here in the painting is Mary wearing a funny headgear and a laser beam shining into it from a UFO in the sky. It's a flying saucer. It's very clear to the modern eye, the uninitiated, what you're looking at. So if you stand in an art gallery and say, oh my goodness, what's that flying saucer doing there? Didn't Ert de Gelder paint exactly the same thing when he described the empowerment of Jesus by John the Baptist? Well, some art authority will come along and say, oh no, that's just an artistic convention. That's how artists for many, many years portrayed these anomalous phenomena. Well, great. Why? Why did they portray them that way? I think, again, they painted what was seen, but how would they know? Well, this goes to how the stories of ancient contact get handled through the course of history. because they're part of a forbidden layer of story. That pattern where the ET narrative gets translated out of the Hebrew scriptures is just one of many stories you could tell from around the world. If you go to take, for instance, the invasion of Central and South America by the Portuguese and the Spanish, they went in, their whole mission was to take that continent for Portugal, the kings of Portugal and Spain, and for the church. And so they had all authority to delete and replace the old narratives. So this they did by burning the old books, executing the priesthoods, and installing churches and schools across the continent to teach Christian orthodoxy, replacing the earlier story. The earlier story was a story in which human origins are tied up with ET contact, with paleo contact. We know that because they didn't manage to burn all the books. And 200 years later, those copies which had not been burned or archived for the Pope, the King of Portugal and the King of Spain, there was a copy that was brought by the successors of the priesthood of the Feathered Serpent and presented to a Dominican friar by the name of Francisco Jimenez, who loved his people enough that he'd won their trust to the extent that they could now say, "Would you like to hear our story of beginnings?" And he said, yes. They gave it to him. He spent 7 years translating it into Spanish. It became the Popol Vuh, and it tells a story of paleo contact and of our species having had its development adjusted by ET visitors. Now, in the meantime, during those 200 years, what's happened to that information? It's been available only to those who can look in the Vatican Library or the libraries of the kings of Portugal and Spain, and it's resided with the survivors of that ancient priesthood. Now, those survivors become esoteric societies that meet in secret, that transmit their tradition in secret from generation to generation. They had to do that for 200 years, but from time to time, they will leak that information back into the public domain through storytelling, through art. And I think that's how some of our artists have had the kind of information that allowed them to paint flying saucers in 1468, because they were privy to that kind of information. It's a pattern that rolls on and on. I mean, if you go to those who wrote for Doctor Who or Star Trek, very often they were fed information that was suppressed, and it either came from esoteric societies or it came from covert ops in the US defense who were engaging with these phenomena. And so that's a long answer to that art question. How did that information get there? How do we read it? That's really the process. It's suppressed information that gets leaked back. And when you or I, humble souls, see it in a film, we think, hold on, I've heard that before. Why does that story keep repeating? Or we see it in a painting. Hold on, Edgar Gelder painted that in 1710. Carlo Crivelli painted it in 1468. And it's also on a glyph that's 60,000 years old in New South Wales up the road from me. What happens if I join the dots?
Wow. Well, when I first started hearing this kind of information, a program rose up in me, and I'm saying this because I think a lot of listeners would say the same thing, and it is, and I don't know where it came from. Well, I assume it came from my Christian upbringing, the great alien deception. That one day they're going to start telling us that aliens made us. Now I'm seeing what you're saying, and this program comes up like, oh, it's the great alien deception, and that I'm not agreeing with that, but I'm just saying, what would you say to people who say it's a deception? You know, what advice would you give them?
Well, I'd want to know where that came from and why anyone would have come up with that story. Why would you need to say one day there'll be a great alien deception? What on earth would make anyone think that?
Yeah.
So obviously they're responding to information that's been out there in the past, and there had to be a reaction to it. But I mean, I know, look, I'm not a Roman Catholic. I'm not a fan of pyramidical shaped, feudalized structures like that. But Nevertheless, the Roman Catholic Church is full of devout people, including a few popes. And I was very interested to see that under the most conservative pope in my lifetime, Benedict XVI, there was an extraordinary invitation to reconsider the question of ETs in the Bible. Benedict XVI called on the Pontifical Academy of Sciences in 2009 to convene a colloquium to discuss the theological implications of contact with other civilizations.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
So civilizations, ETs.
Yep.
And so they actually had this colloquium, and senior spokespeople for the Pope came out from that. They went to the press and essentially said there's no issue, and we shouldn't be surprised to be in touch with them sooner than anyone expects. So there is a faith authority saying you should not be freaked out by this subject. We should not approach it with the kind of paranoia that you just named there, Craig.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
We need to approach it with an open eye, and an open eye not only to contact, but to realizing the contact has been spoken about in the Bible. Well, that was really a gauntlet thrown down to the theologians of the world, which has been roundly ignored. Yeah. And I felt when I wrote Escaping from Eden, if no one else is going to do this, I'm going to do this. I'm going to look at that topic because I think there may be something there. And what I found absolutely blew me away. Mm-hmm. And I would just encourage people to look at the texts, follow the logic, find out about the word Elohim, reread the Elohim stories and decide for themselves. Is the Bible trying to deceive us with this information, or has it recorded stories that we would do well to retranslate and understand with a 21st century framework? Because there's a different story there, hidden in plain sight, one told by our ancestors from cultures all around the world. You're going to have to debunk every indigenous culture in the world if you want to maintain that alien deception idea. Are you really wanting to go there?
Well, and too, I mean, just the whole Merkaba or the chariots that are mentioned. You know, of course, we got that, and then we have even frequency that's in the Bible multiple times. It says we wrestle not against flesh and blood, and that word wrestle means we vibrate. So speaking about technology, whether it's in art or in the Bible or what have you, where do you think this technology is? If it was so normal and rampant, like, why are we not seeing? I mean, people, obviously there are observations of ships out there and people keep seeing it. Some of it's hidden, some of it people now, because of social media, you could just like put it on YouTube or what have you. But why do you think we're still not talking about it? What do you think? What's all that about?
Oh, why are we not talking about it is a really interesting question, because there's been so much that's been out in the public domain and has been on the news that is really earth-shattering. Mm-hmm. So we had, for instance, in 2017, the leaking of the Tic Tac footage. Yep. The USS Nimitz had this encounter with Tic Tac craft, and we've now all seen that film on the TV, on YouTube. It was allowed to be released. And then the Pentagon came clean and authenticated the footage and said, yes, actually, secretly, we've had a unit in place for 70 years under different names whose job it is to research materials retrieved from UFO crashes. Hello?
I know, yeah.
And then just before Christmas, we had, and all that's, it's all confirmed. I mean, we heard that from Chris Mellon, the former Assistant Secretary of Defense for Presidents Clinton and George W. Bush. We heard it from Luis Elizondo, who headed up that unit for 10 years. Those stories, if you don't trust those guys, were confirmed by the former chief of French intelligence, Alain Juillet. We've heard from physicists involved in the actual physical research. So Eric Davis would be one in America, and Jacques Vallée in France would be another. All that's in the public domain. Just before Christmas, we heard from Haim Eshed, Israel's chief of space security, the brigadier general who held that position for 27 years, saying on the basis of all the privileged information to which he has had access in that role, his understanding is we are already in contact with an intergalactic Federation, so many ET demographics, but that the Federation has chosen not to self-disclose until our understanding of space is a bit more developed. These are very credible people. It's all been in the news. Why are we not all talking about it? I really can't answer that, other than I keep going back to the movie Gladiator, where a very shrewd Caesar comes into power, who realizes that if you provide the public with enough entertainment, you, the powers, can get away with anything, because people will stop asking questions. And I wonder if it's something like that we're actually so overwhelmed with information, entertainment, that we don't, and of course we've had a pandemic on, and with all that happening, we just haven't had the spare time, energy to say, hold on, what did he just say? That seems to be what's happened, that the information is out there and people are not reacting to it. Even the whitewash of the Senate briefing process in June. People who were into this subject were very frustrated by it, because they'd been waiting for the Senate briefings in which they thought the Pentagon was going to come clean and brief US government on ET contacts and all the conclusions from researching these physical materials. And they thought, great, some disclosure at last. And then what came out after 70 years of this unit being in place? Apparently they only had 9 pages of data to share, except we now discover that some of the major agencies didn't play ball with that process at all. So people were disappointed who were waiting for disclosure, but there was real information in there that ought to have been mind-blowing to a broader audience, because even in those 9 pages, there's an acknowledgement of the UFO phenomenon as something real, that US defense operations are interfered with on average, and this is just over the last 17 years, every 6 weeks by UFOs. And it goes on and says there is zero evidence these UFOs are the technology of another power or covert operations at home. Well, that ought to be enough information to get people to say, wait, what? And yet we seem to have had our eye on other balls, and it hasn't become a major part of what we see in the news. But I'm finding through my books, Escaping from Eden, The Scars of Eden, through the Fifth Kind TV, there's a huge appetite for this information out there among the general public. We put out one video that really has some key material in it from The Scars of Eden. It's had 8.5 million views in the last 18 months or so. That's a lot of interest. And so I really wish the mainstream media would play ball with this, because people do want to know about these things.
That I couldn't agree more with that. What I've found is, with everything that's happened over the past 18 months, funny you should say that figure, with the pandemic and all that, is people are asking the deeper questions. It's like our whole reality has fallen apart. Like the whole world is going through this strange situation. And I've noticed people who were just kind of happy with just living an average life are all of a sudden asking the deeper questions, like, who are we? What are we doing as a species? You know, what's going on? You know, and I think that could provide some a level of answer to why your material is so attractive to people, because it's providing answers, and very, very well sourced and well researched answers.
And that interest is across the generations, Craig.
Yeah,
I'm really interested in this. I would say from the 30s up, there's a really strong interest. People a bit younger than that are desperate, trying to establish themselves, of course, in the world, and might not have the time and mental energy to probe into this. But I find, looking at my audience, 30s up, and I was saying to my wife Ruth yesterday, I have been so humbled in the last week by the number of men in their 70s who have contacted me, who have said, I'm questioning my old worldview. I'm coming to the understanding we're in a populated universe. I'm reframing what I thought about central ideas in my faith. And now I've discovered your channel, and now I've discovered your books, and you've accelerated that process for me. So here are people who, of an age, who it surprises me and delights me that they are going through a process of reviewing and reconsidering and opening up to all these kinds of topics that we're flagging today.
Well, and I'm going to jump in. We know Ronald Reagan spoke a bit about, well, what if there was like an outside force that kind of led to believe there was stuff going on. Of course, then we got Space Force that was released. Why do we need to spend trillions of dollars on a Space Force if there isn't a need for a Space Force? Because there definitely needs to be. But of course, at the same time that all gets released, they had a Netflix kind of like documentary / make fun of the whole thing, making fun of the president and or just the idea of having it like it's just a joke to kind of, I guess, pad it a little bit to just get people like, don't really believe any of this, there's that. But you mentioned the thing about the intervention, every 6 months that they're seeing, not just, and just for people who
6 weeks,
every 6 weeks. Sorry, 6 weeks. Sorry. For people who are watching, please understand, we don't mean that means like we just saw something come in over a base or something. We're talking about nuclear reactors that are being dismantled on a regular because they're somehow figuring out that we're going to blow ourselves up if we don't have some intervention here. And this is like across the board, many nuclear reactors who have just like stopped working.
Around the world.
Yes. And so there's that. And then going back into what we were talking about with this 18 months, I'm also seeing, because I was in Montauk as a kid, I was part of the Montauk Project. My dad was military, and he was on all of these radars around the world that did some of this stuff. And he doesn't seem to act like he knows anything about it. Maybe he does, or maybe he just was so categorized in his job that they weren't told everything. But I'm seeing too with just like the hyper trigger, Schumann resonance, whatever you want to call it, of just things that a lot of memories of people who've been taken or had, my lab issues or, just a lot of things like this, whether there's abductions or pregnancies and miscarriages and, whether it's through seeding or what have you, so where people are like, it's triggering, these flashes of things who maybe they've had the flashes before, but they didn't really put them together to make any sense of it because it didn't make sense in the reality we were in where no one talked about it. But now that all these things have come to the forefront, I think a lot of people are more willing. And just like that guy you were talking about from Israel, they asked him, why haven't you said anything? Why are you just saying it now? And he said 10 years ago, or even, I think it might have been 5 years ago, he said if he had said this, they would have locked him up. But now he can just talk about it. And a lot of people are being very vocal about experiences that they've had. You care to speak a little bit about that?
Definitely. And there has, he's quite right, been a massive shift in how the authorities respond to disclosures, particularly from officials. And that's happened in the last decade or so, I would say. So I think it was back in 2008 when Dmitry Medvedev, then the Prime Minister of Russia, on camera told a journalist, we're already in contact. Every new prime minister in Russia is given the folder detailing the species we're already in contact with. And I'm not sure if it's up on YouTube at the moment. It goes on and off. But at some point, you can look at that for yourself and ask if you think he's joking. I think he's dead serious. And there was no debunking that followed from Vladimir Putin. He didn't go on the TV and said, I would like to distance myself from the comments of my late prime minister friend. Nothing like that. He was just allowed to say that. Whereas you go back to the days of Ronald Reagan, you mentioned with the SDI, the Star Wars initiative, people were intrigued by that at the time. And the way he announced it was, there is a really pregnant pause in that speech that he made at the United Nations And during the pause, you're left to ask, sorry, is he talking about an alien threat of something or a threat of alien something? There was that ambiguity. And we were all wondering, why do we need weapons in space? Is it really for terrestrial conflicts, or is it to protect us from conflicts from outside? Well, while the public was wondering about this, I lived down the road from a special research facility in the UK. We were really proud of that facility because they were involved in the research and development for Reagan's Star Wars initiative. So we were really proud that that was in our part of the world. And then we started getting worried as one by one, the people working on that project committed suicide. And by the time 25 of them had committed suicide, although the coroners wouldn't agree with that, they kept returning open verdicts. And with that happening, the suicides, the open verdicts, we had, I think it was Clive Jenkins, the head of the union for that level of research scientists, going on the TV and saying there must be a government inquiry because this number of suicides is statistically impossible. So that's going back to the 80s, where they were so frightened of disclosure from some credible person, they would, let's be plain, kill people to stop them talking. 10 years ago, 15 years ago, Hamish Shedd says there would be other consequences. Now, Alan Gillier can speak, Chris Mellon can speak, Luis Elizondo can speak, Ed Mitchell can more or less say he knows that the government knows that we have ET contact, and he insists that they come clean. Didn't kill him. They allowed him to speak. NASA did meet the press and say, Ed Mitchell is a great American, but we do not share his views. More recently still, the authorities don't even do that. So there has been a big shift in that pattern as to what's being said and not being debunked or having authorities distance themselves from it. So yes, that's a huge shift that's happened. What was the other half of your question, Sharnael?
I don't know if I had a question as much. Well, I do. I have lots of questions. But so, who is Jesus to you? Because I read the Law of One, and when they started talking about their version, I was like Craig. I was like, oh my God, don't go there. Like, please leave Jesus alone. Like all whatever. I was open to all this stuff, and it was when they got to the Jesus part, I was like, oh. No, but now I'm totally like, okay, whatever. We're all ETs. This is fine, whatever. But you mentioned Elohim could be replaced with even demon. So, and some people would say, well, these reptilians, these are just demons. So, like, go into that a little bit of like, who's God, who's Jesus, and and I'm open to hearing what you have to say about that. And then the demons versus, ETs on that too.
Okay. Well, I would say anyone who's into Jesus has an instant. I've got an echo on the line. Oh, it's just gone. There we are. Anyone who's into Jesus, I think, ought to be automatically reading my books, because they should already have heaps of questions about the Old Testament. Because if God is as Jesus said God is, then the stories in the Old Testament, Hebrew scriptures, they don't line up with that morality. They don't line up with that character. So a lot of churches respond to that problem by not preaching on the Old Testament. And I don't think that's the answer. I think you go in and you say, all right, is that a God story or not? And if it isn't, what is it? So I do that in Escaping from Eden, and I reveal what I believe to be the case, that we've got a whole spectrum of entities, archonic entities, interdimensional entities, extraterrestrial entities. They're all part of those ancient stories. And by the end of Escaping from Eden, hopefully the reader's going, yeah, I think I've followed that. So where does that leave Jesus? And then I go a bit further into that in the Scars of Eden, because it does, if your ideas of God changed through that process, you have to come back and say, where does Jesus fit into the story? We tell the story of Jesus as a unique story. And it's been very important to Christianity to emphasize the uniqueness of Jesus, because that's the USP of Christianity. We have Jesus and he's different to everybody else. Now, I love Jesus. I love his teachings. I seek to live my life by them. But it's not as unique a story as sometimes we think. Take, for instance, the doctrines of the Roman Catholics have a doctrine of the Immaculate Conception of Mary, and then all Christians have the doctrine of the virgin birth of Jesus. Go to those stories, read them. Well, there's only one in the Bible, which is the virgin birth story. Here's a pregnancy that follows a close encounter with an entity that we understand to be an angel, whatever one of those is, called Gabriel. So here's someone, she's not pregnant, she has a close encounter, and now she is pregnant with someone very special and important. That's not a unique story. Exactly the same thing happened to Mary's cousin, Elizabeth. Mm-hmm. She wasn't going to have a baby. She has a close encounter with an entity we call an angel, whatever one of those is, and then she's pregnant with someone so significant that Jesus said he, John the Baptist, was the greatest human being who ever lived. Those are not unique stories. Same thing happened to the mother of Samson in the stories of the Judges in the Hebrew Scriptures. Same thing happened, and here's the first mention of it really, to Abraham and Sarah. They're not going to have a baby. They're too old. They have a close encounter with three Elohim. Now we know they're sky people. Now we know they're ETs. Here's the prototype experience in the Bible. A close encounter with ETs resulting in an anomalous pregnancy. So the story of Jesus fits into a whole pattern of close encounters in the Bible, and the biblical stories fit into an even wider pattern. Ask Lao Tzu's mum what happened to her, same story. Wow. Ask the mother of Vipassi Buddha, the 22nd incarnation of Buddha before Siddhartha Gautama Buddha. Ask the mother of the Yellow Emperor. It's the same story. And curiously, just to bring it back to our earlier conversation about art, the way Lao Tzu's mum, for instance, describes what happened before she got pregnant, there was a light that came from space, and then she was pregnant. Isn't that the Carlo Crivelli painting? Isn't that the Ert de Gelder painting? Yes, it is. So there's a bigger pattern of which the story of Jesus is a part. As I did my research, I was blown away to remember, I should have known this, that many of the early church fathers believed in paleo-contact. And they taught the kinds of things I'm teaching in the Scars of Eden and Escaping from Eden. And they came to that belief because they got it from Plato. So I thought, oh, crumbs, I'd better reread Plato. And sure enough, Plato, there's paleo-contact, there are ETs, there's previous civilization, there's transdimensional beings, there's channeling, we can communicate with them through altered states. It's all there in Plato. And I thought, how did I read Plato at theological college and miss all these interesting bits? Somehow I did, but it's all there. So the reason I'm mentioning that is that those who wrote the stories of Jesus knew Plato like the back of their hand. The writer of the Gospel of John knew Plato like the back of his hand. So did the Apostle Paul. Many quotes of the Apostle Paul that people are familiar with, they're actually Plato quotes where he's changed a couple of words. So he was a huge fan of Plato. And Plato describes human existence at lots of levels. And he has this idea that we are beings of consciousness before we are material beings. And then we have a material experience in this life, and then our conscious experience continues afterwards. And that consciousness is a participation in source consciousness. And that source consciousness is what preceded the material universe. It just goes on. And the more you read it, the more you think you're reading 21st century quantum. But I mentioned that because John then repeats that storyline and applies it to Jesus. And so by the time you've read Plato, by the time you've reread the Hebrew Scriptures in that light, just as the early church fathers did, you come back to Jesus and realize he's part of a much bigger story, that his story of beginning with God, having a material life, returning to God, is a model of our own lives. That his anomalous birth is one of many that have been recorded throughout history. And so I don't say this in any way to debunk Jesus, because I am a follower of Jesus, but I'm seeking to understand what are the stories that have been left to us when we translate the text more closely, and when we read them in the context of the narratives our ancestors have bequeathed to us from every culture through the millennia. And a different story emerges, and it's a fascinating one.
Absolutely brilliant, and I'm glad you asked that, Sharnael, because that was going to be one of my questions as well. Because when I started sort of branching out from, dare I say, beyond Christianity, and by that I mean, pardon me, studying ancient civilization, and you soon realise that the history that we've been taught is a load of rubbish, to put it bluntly, much of it anyway. Because then you've got like the Sumerian texts, and I always had this issue, like, how can this Sumerian text be true? Because I'm a believer in the Bible and I believe the Genesis story. But obviously what you do by introducing this concept of the Elohim, you're actually showing us that it's the same story. We've just been it's been heavily misinterpreted and misrepresented to us about what's being said. And like you say, it's not just the Sumerian text. There's pretty much, I mean, the Zulu culture, most world cultures, indigenous cultures have thereabouts the same creation story of humanity, that we were put here. And I mean, I've heard scientists, like Greg Braden, as an example, say how we just kind of mysteriously appeared 200,000 years ago, that it didn't, the process of evolution that was happening on the planet, that the appearance of humans was very, very anomalous, and there has to be a divine intervention there, a divine intelligence. Now, we've obviously always said it's God, God meaning some bearded man with a cloak walking through the Garden of Eden. And what we're realizing is that's not what the Bible's telling us. The Bible is confirming to us that our genetic makeup, what makes us who we are, is from beyond, from the heavens. And I think that's a really important point to make, because just because again, 4 years ago, if I'd have heard me saying this, I'd have been, well, I've lost my mind, I'm a heretic, but we just have to be honest with ourselves. And I talk a lot about having this mental shelf, that when there's something that I hear that really contradicts my beliefs, or I struggle with, I put it on the shelf. And I've interviewed someone recently. The shelf is fast becoming a warehouse because there's so many things encountering. But this is a huge one about, certainly as Christians, expanding our worldview and just being honest about what the Bible teaches us.
Definitely. And Craig, I should say, you're not a heretic.
And
because saying these things actually doesn't contradict the central dogmas of Christianity that are in the creed. Yeah. So just educate anyone who calls you a heretic, and you wouldn't even have been on the fringe in the very beginning of Christianity until you get to about 144 AD. If you, Craig, had been in your church prior to that date, you would have just been a regular guy, because this was part of the mainstream conversation, and it was only as orthodoxy narrowed and the Gnostic texts were ruled out and were buried for their protection, as orthodoxy became militarized, and then there were excommunications and anathematizations as we went through the process of the councils. Before all that, Christianity was a kaleidoscope of experiences and theologies and documents, and paleo contact was well and truly there. It was part of what many theologians believed at that time in the church and outside it, because Plato had got his views from other places, from all around the world, from the East, from Egypt. It was part of international thought at that time. And this is why I thought it was so exciting what Benedict XVI did, of saying, let's put all those questions back on the table, because we may have ruled some things out that should have been ruled in.
I got one final question. I know you got to go, but I hope I can have time for one more question. I have lots of more questions.
A million.
We might have to have you back for a part 2, but
sure thing.
yeah, okay, so I do scalar waves, and we tested Jesus. 1,000 is the highest we've ever found anyone on the planet, and he tested highest, as well as Mary Magdalene, and they seem to have a twin flame. We've also tested, like Buddha and different yogis and all these other people too, which seem to be really high, like 700s, 600s, 800s. Even Joan of Arc was started out like 100, but raised herself, like became, I guess, grew into who she is. Although she incarnated at 500, which is love, she dropped at birth and then built herself back up to 700. And you see these stories, but it kind of goes back to 2 things. Is number one, when they've tested off planet beings, some of them are in like 11,000 or 8,000 or what have you. And so it goes back to who is God then, I guess, how do you answer that? But then also when you're mentioning all these other stories, my background from my grandparents were Scandinavian. And so I'm like obsessed with watching anything about, Norway and Vikings and, that whole Thor and, of course, those stories, right? But that's considered paganism. So where does paganism fit into that? And then also, can you just tell me who God is? I mean, geez.
I'd love to know.
All right, paganism and God. I mean, the word pagan, what a wonderful, demeaning word that is. I mean, that's how we have talked about non-Christian story, non-Christian religion through the centuries.
Yeah.
There's such an association with that word. And I gave the example of deleting and replacing the old stories in Central and South America. Well, that's happened in different ways all around the world. The British did this when they went into North America and they illegalized the initiation ceremonies that passed these secret stories along. And there were genocides, as we know. Went into Ghana, and the way they got rid of these stories was more through demeaning them, so that the Christianity they put upon Ghanaians was a Christianity that, well, like you were hinting earlier, Craig, really forbade looking at things outside of the canon of Christian interest in Christian texts. And if your grandma or great aunt was a shaman with phenomenal knowledge of our place in the cosmos and how to live more conscious on this planet, you would be taught to rubbish her and call her an idolater or a witch doctor, because the British didn't want to just slaughter all the witch doctors. But if we can make people feel they're primitive and stupid and ignorant and uneducated,
like they're doing now to
then
doctors.
we don't. Yeah, exactly. Yes. If we ridicule those bringing a different story, no one will listen to them. Mm-hmm. And so that's just one example of what happened in one place, but it's part of a pattern. And we talked earlier about how the culture shifted from a time when everyone coming forward with a disclosure or an anomalous experience would be in the past killed and then debunked, and now they're just allowed to speak. Mm-hmm. Although they don't get a lot of press, and the story, the news cycle moves on. So I think paganism is interesting. I mean, the Norse stories are fascinating because not only have we got these advanced beings in the Norse stories, we've got stories of hybridization. And the hybridization creates this terrible controversy among the gods. Mm-hmm. Wait, haven't I heard that story before? Yes, I have. That's right. The ancient Greeks told that story. Mm-hmm. Hold on. Didn't the Celts tell it as well? Yes, they did. And aren't there other abduction stories bringing it right up to the present day in the Celtic tradition? Yes, there are. Weren't they written about in the late 1500s by Robert Kirk, a Presbyterian minister, again, very conservative Christian, but having to acknowledge there's this other presence on planet Earth that's interfering with human history. That's a story that you can find in cultures all around the world. But the stories are maintained at the grassroots. If you want to hear the stories of ET abductions that are thousands of years old in Ghana, you won't find it in the school textbooks. You have to listen to the locals. Same in Kenya, listen to the locals. Same in the Caribbean. Same in the Philippines. Same in India. Same in Greece. Same in every culture. These stories are carried in the folklore. So we're back to folklore. Doesn't sound very educated, does it? Or pagan, that sounds awful. But that's where the stories are. And so part of the reframing a lot of us do is to go back to the forbidden sources, the naughty sources, the uneducated, and say, sorry, can you tell me that story again? Because I'm beginning to join some dots here. So that's where paganism fits in. We are taught to look down on the traditions that maintain these sources of information all around the world. So there's that. And then who is God? Well, just briefly, I like the Apostle Paul's definition of God. It's a definition he gives when he's speaking to a non-Jewish, non-Christian audience in Plato's city, in Athens. And he finds, therefore, he has to define God from scratch. And he said, by God, this is in Acts 17, if people want to look it up. By God, I mean the source of the cosmos and everything in it, that in which we all live and move and have our being.
Yes.
Yep.
I love that definition of God because it's a cosmic vision. It is an idea that is more easy for people to do business with than the word God, because that's layered with so many religious ideas. The cosmic source. Okay, well, what's that? Can we have a conversation about that? And I like the fact that the way Paul describes it there's no separation. We all live and move and have our being in the source of the cosmos. So my intelligence is a participation in source intelligence. My consciousness, a participation in source consciousness. We are all connected with one another and with the source. And he really does apply the implications of that in that talk, because he then laughs at the idea of sacrificial religion, the idea that we need to serve God, that God would need anything from us. If God is the source of the cosmos, God doesn't need us to provide God with stuff. It's the other way around. And once you take that service and separation idea out, you've pulled the rug out from religious patterns that would seek to manipulate us, because religion is so often manipulative when it trades on a separation anxiety. You are separated from God. You need to claw your way back into his good books, and we'll tell you how. That's essentially the power to manipulate of every priesthood in every religion around the world. And Paul says, no. We all live and move and have our being in God, the source. We couldn't be more intimately connected. So I find that a very empowering vision. It's a very Platonic vision as well. Surprise, surprise. And I think taking that separation anxiety out allows you to go back to your texts, whatever religion you're following, and begin to read the teachings in a different light and realize these traditions are full of wonderful stuff to actually help you live your life. But the old narratives of do the right thing or you'll be punished, serve properly or you'll be consigned to an endless hell, you begin to see through that and realize that these are things we've layered over the top of our ancient texts. And the more we can peel those back, the better for everybody.
Okay. I'm sure you have something to say, Craig, but I do have one more question from the audience here.
Okay.
So Nancy Calm is on here. She's a dear friend of mine. She is curious to know, let's see. She says, please ask Paul if, of course, if Satan was with God, how could somebody be with God and fall if being in such a high vibration of power and love?
Yes, well, there we are. We have the retelling of sky people stories in the Bible in a way that makes it sound like God and the devil stories. And it gets very confusing. So that's part of what I do in Escaping from Eden, is just pick that apart a little bit and allow us to see that many of these stories that we thought were God and the devil stories are actually stories of conversations and sometimes conflicts between Elohim, conflicts between sky people.
Yeah.
And so if you go to stories of the Sky Council in the Bible or the fall in Genesis 3, suddenly you realize this isn't a battle between God and the devil. This is humanity caught in the crossfires of conflicts among the ETs who came and colonized us in the deep past. That's what's really going on.
I mean, that again, that just changes so much for our understanding of the Old Testament. I mean, one of the burning questions for me, and again, we may not have time to answer this, I don't know, was where does the reptile in the garden come into it for you? I have my theories, but I'd love to hear yours.
Okay. The reptile in the garden. He is called the serpent. It's true. So not a snake, as we'd conventionally understand, because apparently he has arms and legs and can speak human. So immediately, you know, something else is going on. Serpent, well, that word actually is indistinguishable from the word dragon. So is this one of the dragon stories of the Hebrew scriptures? Some of them are very, very graphic and very similar to dragon stories from other cultures, whether it's Welsh or Chinese. There are these dragons that presided over their colonies of human beings, and prodigious numbers of them. What are those doing in the Bible? Well, I actually don't think the serpent story in Genesis 3 is the story of a dragon with its colony of humans eating them, because the character is playing a different role in that story. So albeit he has that name, as soon as you read the Mesopotamian stories, you know this is a retelling of the conflict between Enlil and Enki over how intelligent human beings should be.
Right. Yeah.
Once you've read the cuneiforms, you go back to Genesis 3 and you realize this isn't the story of a fall. This is the story of an upgrade in human intelligence. At the moment, it's translated as God and the serpent, or Yahweh and the serpent. And Yahweh, or God, wants to keep the human beings so unintelligent they don't even know they're naked. And the serpent wants them to have a better human experience, wants them to be fertile, intelligent, conscious. And he breaks ranks to achieve that upgrade. So, you know, any Christian or Jewish reader ought to think, oh, that's odd. The serpent is in favor of a better human experience, fertile, intelligent, conscious, and God wants us so dim, we're at an animal level, we don't even know we're naked. What? That doesn't make sense. No, it does not make sense. That's correct. Realize this is a retelling of the Enlil and Enki story, and oh, of course, it's a conflict among ET colonizers over how intelligent they're going to make the human beings. Do they want to stay with this species of clones just smart enough to work in their minds that are hinted at in Genesis and described more explicitly in other texts at that level? Or are we going to let them be a proper species? Enki, aka the serpent, realizes the humans are not happy. That just as the animals all have a male and a female, the humans need a male and a female. They're all depressed. They can't continue like this. There has to be an upgrade. This isn't going to work. He's the one who's on planet Earth. Enki is the Earth captain, the Earth commander. Enlil is in charge of this region of space. So Enki's closer to the humans, wants to upgrade them, upgrades them. That's the story buried in plain sight in Genesis 3. And by the time you're in the 3rd chapter of Genesis, reading Elohim in the plural, you see that story for what it is.
Okay. Yeah, we're going to have to schedule a part 2 for sure, because I have
I've got so many more questions.
every time you say something, then it sparks a new question. But thank you so much. Craig and I are so just honored to have you here. And I am, so where can we tell people your books, where to find them, where people can connect with you, just any final words, and yeah, go for it.
Absolutely. If you go to Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Kindle, Book Depository, Hive, wherever books are sold, you should find Escaping from Eden and The Scars of Eden. If you'd like to get into conversation with me about those, you can find me at The Fifth Kind TV on YouTube and the Paul Wallis channel on YouTube. If you want to do some coaching with me, and I do a lot of work with people trying to reframe their worldview in the light of an experience or in the light of paleo contact, come to my website, which is paulanthonywallis.com, Anthony with an H, Wallis, W-A-L-L-I-S, paulanthonywallis.com. We can get into conversation, and you can keep up with all the work I'm up to these days. And I mustn't forget to say, Sharnael and Craig, I've enjoyed this conversation so much. Thank you so much for having me on. I'll be more than happy to do a rematch.
Wonderful.
Awesome. Thank you. And Craig, where can we find you? I mean, I know where to find you, but
you know where to find me. WhatsApp normally. People that don't know, my wife and I run a crystal shop, crystalfalls.co.uk. If you want to take a look at that. I'm also in a band, nthascension.com. I play drums in that band. I'm just a researcher. I'm journeying through life, looking for the truth, and I'm very grateful for people like Paul and Sharnael who are doing the work and putting themselves out there. I'm so grateful, and I cannot recommend Paul's channel enough. The Fifth Kind. I'm going through. There's like hours and hours worth of videos on there of really well produced, high quality videos. We haven't even touched on Enoch yet and the giants in Genesis 6. We haven't even touched on many things. So yeah, we're going to have to do a round 2. I'm well up for that.
Awesome.
And we'll get you some dates, Paul, right away, straight away, so we can make sure and get you on the book before the end of the year. But thank you. So go to swiftfire.org, get on the newsletter. I'm a naturopathic doctor. We have a show. I have books on the science of miracles. I also do scheduling. You guys know the whole thing. Go to swiftfire.org and find all of our teachings, books, resources, classes, workshops, and all of our shows that we have. So please go to swiftfire.org, get on the newsletter. That's the best way to find me, just because sometimes censorship likes to do its thing. They pulled my channel a few times and definitely been in jail my share. So love you guys so much, and looking forward to the next time we're together. You guys have a great night, and or for you it's day, right, Paul? Or I don't know what time it is for you, Craig.
Yes, the beginning of a new day.
Yes. So you guys have a great one, and we will talk soon. Thanks everybody for hanging out with us. Please do share and tag. Bye-bye.
Bye.